You're 9 years old, standing on a kitchen chair, stirring a pot so it doesn't burn. In the next room, your parent is sleeping off a night shift, or a depression, or something you don't have words for yet. The adults around you say, "You're so mature for your age." You smile. Inside, you're not sure if you had another choice. Psychologists have a name for the psychology of a child who grew too fast. Family therapist Ivan Bossor-Menin-Nagy called it parentification, when a child becomes, in many ways, the parent. It's not just helping out. It's a quiet, profound shift in who is allowed to need care and who is expected to provide it. Bossor-Menin-Nagy and later researchers like Gregory Jerkovic argued that in a healthy family, care flows mostly downward, from adults to children. When that flow reverses, because of illness, addiction, poverty, migration, or emotional unavailability, the child steps in. They become the emotional glue, the organizer, the protector. On the outside, it looks like impressive maturity. On the inside, it's often a systematic sacrifice of their own developmental needs. The core mechanism is simple and powerful. To keep attachment, the bond with caregivers, intact, the child adjusts to what the family needs, not to what their age needs. John Bowlby's attachment theory helps here. Children are wired to keep caregivers close because closeness means survival. If being the strong one keeps you close, you learn to be strong. If having no needs keeps the peace, you learn to have no needs. For example, imagine a 10-year-old named Maya. Every morning, she checks her younger brother's homework, packs his lunch, and reminds her mother about rent. She knows which days her mother is in a good mood before a single word is spoken. She has learned to read microscopic facial cues. At school, teachers praise her. "You're so responsible. You're like a little adult." Maya likes the praise. It feels like proof she's doing her job. But at night, when her brother is finally asleep, she lies awake, stomach aching. There was no room today for her bad mood, her confusion, her questions. She has become, in Erik Erikson's terms, focused on industry and responsibility long before she's had the freedom to explore play, identity, and dependence. She is skipping parts of her own developmental story to hold everyone else's together. Research on parentification shows a double edge. Jerkovic and others find that children who take on some family responsibilities can develop empathy, competence, and resilience when their efforts are recognized and balanced with real care for them. But when the load is heavy, chronic, and invisible, rates of anxiety, depression, and relationship difficulties rise. It's not just growing up fast. It's growing up around your own needs, learning to walk carefully so you don't disturb the fragile adults in the room. This helps explain certain adult patterns that might feel mysterious. Why you feel guilty when you rest. Why you scan every room for who needs help before you even notice how you feel. Why being called selfish stings more than almost anything else. Why, when someone finally offers to take care of you, you don't quite know what to do with your hands. It also reframes what looks, from the outside, like remarkable strength. The old soul child. The teenager everyone vents to. The young adult who always has it together but cannot answer the simple question, "What do you want?" It's not just personality. It's adaptation, an intelligent, creative response to a system that asked a child to be older than their years. Understanding the psychology of a child who grew too fast isn't about blaming parents. It's about seeing the full picture. Many caregivers are overwhelmed, unsupported, or struggling with their own unresolved pain. Children step up because they love, because they're loyal, because on some level they know that if they don't, things may fall apart. The tragedy is not that they care. The tragedy is that they feel they must do it alone. So where does that leave you, if any of this feels familiar? It suggests that part of healing is not just working harder, being stronger, or becoming even more mature. It's allowing the timeline of your life to become less compressed, letting younger parts of you finally show up, needy, playful, confused, curious, and discovering that the world doesn't collapse when you do. In the end, this is a universal human story, even if the details differ. All of us at some point feel out of sync with our age, too young for what life demands, or too old for what it offers. To notice the child who grew too fast, whether in yourself or someone else, is to ask a gentle question. Where did you have to hurry, and what would it mean to slow down now? Because being human is not just about surviving the roles you were handed. It's about gradually reclaiming the right to grow at a pace that belongs to you. You're in a meeting at work, and someone drops a new urgent task on the table. Before you even think, your hand is in the air. I can take that. Later, you're exhausted, a little resentful, but if someone asks why you volunteered, you say, I don't know, it just felt like I should. Psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott had a way of understanding this kind of automatic, over-responsible self. He called it the false self, the version of you that learns to shape itself around other people's needs and expectations. It's not just being helpful. It's building an entire identity around being the one who holds everything together. Winnicott's basic idea was this: a baby is born with a true self, raw, spontaneous, full of impulses, needs, and feelings. If caregivers are good enough, not perfect, just reliably responsive, the child gradually feels safe enough to be real. But when caregivers are consistently unavailable, unpredictable, or fragile, the child adapts. They sense, even without words, my real feelings are too much. I need to become what you can handle. For the child who grows up too fast, this adaptation can become a full-time job. Instead of asking, what do I feel? You learn to ask, what do you need from me right now? Instead of, is this okay for me? You ask, will this upset you? The result is a self that looks impressively composed and quietly disconnected from its own inner life. For example, imagine you as a teenager. Your friends are arguing. You immediately step into the role of mediator, reading each person's emotions, smoothing the tension, cracking a joke to lighten the mood. You notice who's withdrawn, who's close to tears, who might explode. You're good at this, people rely on you. But when someone turns and asks, and how are you doing? You freeze for a second. You scan for an acceptable answer, something that won't burden anyone. I'm fine, you say, even if you're not sure what you actually feel. Winnicott would say, in those moments, your false self is speaking. Not fake in a deceitful sense, but protective. A shield that forms when your mind learns that harmony is safer than honesty, and maturity is safer than need. This helps explain why, as an adult who grew up too fast, you might struggle with surprisingly basic things. Knowing what you like, not just what you're good at. Recognizing your own limits before you collapse. Letting someone see you when you're messy, indecisive, or unsure. It's not just low self-esteem or being too nice. It's years of practice in being who others needed you to be, and very little practice in being who you actually are. You see this again in the way you relate to standards and expectations. The psychologist Jeffrey Young, who developed schema therapy, described deep, repeating patterns he called schemas, like emotional templates that guide how you see yourself and others. Two of these are especially common in people who grew up too fast: the self-sacrifice schema and the unrelenting standards schema. Young argued that these schemas don't appear out of nowhere. They develop when certain emotional needs, like the need to be cared for, to be allowed to be a child, to make mistakes, were chronically unmet. So your mind builds guiding rules, almost like internal laws. Others come first. If I don't handle it, no one will. If I relax, something bad will happen. I must always be competent, composed, and useful. For example, imagine you're sick. You have a fever, a pounding headache, and your body is begging you to rest. But you find yourself answering emails, checking on family members, managing group chats, apologizing for not doing more. You feel a subtle shame, as if being temporarily unavailable makes you a bad person. You're not just uncomfortable with being unproductive, you're uncomfortable with being someone who needs care. Or think about relationships. A partner says, "If something's wrong, tell me." You want to, but inside, another voice whispers, "If you show too much, they'll leave. Don't be dramatic. Handle it yourself." So you swallow your feelings, solve your own problems, and present the finished version, the edited story, not the messy process. Schema research shows that these patterns are stubborn because they were originally protective. Self-sacrifice helped you keep fragile adults stable. Unrelenting standards helped you avoid criticism, chaos, or neglect. Your younger self was not broken, they were creative under pressure. This helps explain why change feels so threatening. Letting someone else carry part of the load is not just a behavioral shift, it feels like breaking a deeply moral rule you've lived by. Rest feels suspicious. Pleasure feels undeserved. Asking for help feels like a betrayal of the identity that once kept you safe. It's not just overachievement. It's loyalty to an old survival strategy that once made perfect sense. There's another layer here, too, the way society sometimes forces certain children to grow up faster than others. Psychologists studying adultification, like Philip Atiba Goff and colleagues, have shown that Black children, for example, are often seen by adults as older, less innocent, and more responsible than they actually are. Girls in many cultures are treated as little mothers to siblings. Immigrant children may become translators, negotiators, cultural bridges. In these contexts, maturity isn't just a family story, it's a social one. Teachers may expect you to be fine on your own. Authorities may show you less protection and more punishment. Praise for being so grown up can mask the fact that your vulnerabilities are going unseen. For example, picture a 12-year-old translating legal documents for their parents. They're praised by officials, "You're so smart, helping your family like this." But no one asks, how does it feel to carry information even adults find overwhelming? Or imagine a Black teenager disciplined at school for attitude, when a white child showing the same behavior is seen as just a kid having a bad day. In both cases, the child's right to be young is quietly stripped away. This broader lens matters because it shows. It's not just that you grew up fast. It's that many systems around you treated you as if you should. So where does this leave you now? An adult who still carries the psychology of the child who grew too fast. It suggests that healing isn't about rejecting your strength, your competence, or your care for others. Those are real and often beautiful parts of you. Instead, it's about expanding your range, allowing room for not knowing, not fixing, not being the most responsible person in the room. For example, you might start with very small, concrete experiments, saying, "Let me think about it," before you automatically say yes. Letting a text sit unanswered for an hour when someone wants something from you. Telling a trusted friend, "I actually don't have it all together today," and noticing what happens when the world does not fall apart. In therapy, this often looks like slowly meeting the parts of you that never got to exist fully. The silly part, the needy part, the angry part, the confused part. Not to indulge them endlessly, but to acknowledge, you were always here, you just had to wait your turn. When you do this, you're not becoming immature. You're allowing your development to unfold in places it once had to freeze. You're letting your life be less of a straight, compressed line and more of a spiral, that sometimes circles back, revisits, and reclaims. And this is where your story touches something universal. All of us, in one way or another, negotiate the balance between adaptation and authenticity. We bend ourselves to fit families, cultures, jobs, relationships. Sometimes that bending becomes who we think we are. To notice the child who grew too fast, inside you or in someone you love, is to ask, where did adaptation quietly replace authenticity? Which strengths in you were once solutions to problems a child should never have had to solve? Because in the end, being human is not just about how early you learn to carry weight. It's about how, over time, you learn to put some of it down. To let others meet you, not just as the person who copes, manages, and understands, but as the person who also wonders, struggles, and needs. And that slow, sometimes shaky permission to be fully human again. That is its own kind of growing up. You're sitting in a classroom, maybe 8 or 9 years old. You've finished your work early again. The teacher, pressed for time, smiles and says, "Since you're so responsible, can you help the others?" You stand up, walk around, lean over classmates' desks, quietly explaining things the way adults explain things. It feels good to be trusted. It also quietly teaches you something. Your role here isn't to learn, it's to hold the room together. Educational psychologists have long studied how expectations shape children. Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson, in their classic Pygmalion in the Classroom study in the 1960s, showed that when teachers believed certain students were bloomers, those students actually improved more over time. It wasn't just ability. It was the quiet power of expectations, interactions, and subtle cues. For a child who grew too fast, those expectations often sound like, "You're the mature one. You don't need as much help. You'll be fine on your own." The mechanism is simple but deep. When adults repeatedly respond to you as if you're less in need, less fragile, more capable, your nervous system and your self-concept adapt. You learn, my value is in being low maintenance, helpful, and composed. You internalize not just skills, but roles. For example, imagine a teacher with 2 students. One is visibly struggling, acting out, asking for attention. The other you is quiet, organized, helpful, and kind. The teacher spends extra time with the struggling child, calling home, modifying assignments, checking in emotionally. With you, the teacher says, "You're doing great, I don't have to worry about you." On the surface, this is praise. Underneath, it's also a form of neglect, not malicious, but real. Your visible competence hides your invisible needs. This helps explain why, as an adult, you might feel strangely unseen in groups. At work, you're trusted, but not always supported. In friendships, you're the listener, not the one people check in on. The old classroom pattern repeats. The squeaky wheels get oil, and you keep the cart moving. It's not just personality. It's years of being treated as if you were already grown, in spaces that were supposed to nurture your growth. There's also the question of what all this does to your body. Because growing up too fast is not just a story in your mind. It's also a pattern in your nervous system. Psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk, in his work on developmental trauma, and Stephen Porges, with polyvagal theory, both point to the way children's bodies adapt to chronic stress. When you're young and constantly monitoring the emotional weather, at home, at school, everywhere, your body learns to stay on alert. Not panicked, maybe, but rarely at rest. Polyvagal theory suggests that your nervous system is always asking, "Am I safe? Can I relax? Or do I need to be ready?" For the child who grew too fast, the answer is often, "I need to be ready, someone might need me, something might go wrong." For example, you're in bed as a child. You're listening. listening for the front door, for raised voices, for footsteps in the hallway that might mean you need to get up, intervene, soothe, or stay very, very quiet. Fast forward to adulthood. You're lying in bed with no crisis, no chaos. Still, your mind races. Did you forget something, disappoint someone, miss a task? Your muscles are tense, your jaw clenched, your breathing shallow. Logically, you know the day is over. Physiologically, your body has not fully gotten the memo. This helps explain why rest feels so strange, even unsafe. Why vacations can make you anxious. Why a quiet weekend can bring up a strange agitation, as if you've misplaced your identity along with your to-do list. It's not just being bad at relaxing. It's a nervous system calibrated early on to stay a little ahead of disaster, to be the one who notices, the one who steps in. Part of healing, then, is not only psychological insight, but physical re-education. Teaching your body slowly that it's allowed to power down. That you don't have to be the night watchman of everyone's emotional world. There's one more layer that educational psychology brings into focus: your basic psychological needs. Edward Desai and Richard Ryan, in Self-Determination Theory, argued that human beings, children and adults, thrive when three needs are met. Autonomy, a sense of choice. Competence, a sense of effectiveness. And relatedness, a sense of connection and belonging. For a child who grew too fast, these needs are often met in skewed ways. You have competence, sometimes more than is fair for your age. You might be the one who cooks, calms, translates, solves. But your autonomy is limited. You're not choosing these roles, you're drafted into them. And your relatedness is conditional. You feel close to others mainly when you're useful, not when you're simply there. For example, you may remember feeling most connected to a parent when you were helping them, cheering them up, listening to their problems, taking care of siblings. When you were quiet, silly, needy, or upset yourself, the connection felt weaker or even risky. So your mind quietly made a deal: to belong, I will be competent; to be loved, I will be strong. This helps explain why, later in life, choices that would deepen autonomy, saying no, changing careers, setting boundaries, feel almost morally wrong. They threaten the old formula: competence plus self-sacrifice equals connection. It's not just difficulty with boundaries. It's fear that if you stop being the capable one, you'll lose your place in the emotional ecosystem you've always known. From this perspective, healing is not just about learning to say no or practicing self-care. It's about slowly rewriting the terms of connection in your life. Letting yourself discover. You can be loved when you're not performing. You can be valued when you're not fixing. You can belong when you're not the one holding everything up. That might start small. Letting a friend see you cry without immediately apologizing. Admitting confusion at work instead of over-preparing in silence. Choosing one task not to take on, just to test what happens to your relationships when you are a little less impressive. If any of this resonates, you might be noticing something important. The psychology of a child who grew too fast is not just about childhood. It's an echo you can hear in your adult choices, your body, your relationships, your work, your idea of who you're allowed to be. And yet, there is a quiet possibility woven through this whole story. The very capacities you built to survive, empathy, awareness, reliability, strength, can now become tools for your own transformation. You know how to read others, you can learn to read yourself. You know how to show up for people, you can practice showing up for the parts of you that never got to arrive. You know how to carry responsibility, you can learn the equally adult skill of sharing it. In that sense, you are not going backwards when you let yourself be more vulnerable, more playful, more uncertain. You're not regressing. You're rounding out your development, giving yourself the pieces of a childhood you had to rush past. And that brings us back to something profoundly human. All of us live between who we had to be and who we might still become. For some, that gap is wide and painful. For you, maybe, it's filled with an early wisdom that came at a cost. To honor the child who grew too fast is to do two things at once. To respect the strength it took to adapt, and to gently question whether those same adaptations still need to run your life. So you might ask yourself, quietly, almost like a promise, if I no longer had to be the one who grew up too soon, who else might I allow myself to be? Because being human is not just about how you learned to survive the past. It's about how you slowly, courageously give yourself permission to live a life that finally moves at the pace of your own true self.